Good morning, everyone. And today we're checking out a video from Popcross Studios. It was The Tragedy of Bobby Blunt. Now, you're probably wondering, and how are we checking out a video from Popcross? Last week, he said he would be going on a week break. That's because I pre-record all my videos. So the week that he actually went out is the video as the week this video is recorded on. So that means there is no gap for me or for y'all. So today, let's hop in and check out some stories of Benny shops across the universe. Oh, well, I guess across dimensions instead. Let's go meet Bobby Blunt.
A great way to inspire people to make positive change is to share with them stories of others who have gone through great struggles and come out the other side as better, happier people. If that was the intention of this story, then it would likely focus on Bella Blunt. Bella's parents were killed in a car accident when she was young.
Oh.
She was then raised by her aunt and uncle while her aunt ran a small-time criminal organization. She was frequently surrounded by people who saw the world as a place where you need to take what you can take and step on whoever you must to get it. Bella managed to stay strong and keep herself from falling into this same lifestyle as those around her. She had missteps early on, but saw where the cynical nature surrounding her could lead and took the necessary steps to not follow that same path.
Yeah, that's
She
good.
eventually grew up to become a librarian who ran free events for children from low-income houses and always made sure to share lessons with them of how they don't have to let their current circumstances determine their future. But while Bella does have a truly inspiring life and story, it is admittedly not nearly as interesting as the tragedy of Bobby Blunt. So, instead of following a truly inspiring person for this tale, we'll instead follow Bobby along the path that Bella avoided. Let it serve as a cautionary tale of what can happen when you don't learn to spot and stop your own self-destructive patterns, ones most often ingrained in you as a child without you even realizing they're there. Bobby was the son of the aunt and uncle that would raise Bella after her parents' deaths. Bobby's father was a loving and caring man who
Oh, so this is Bella's cousin.
worked hard to earn an honest living in case his wife was ever caught in her criminal ventures and lost all the money she earned illegally. Bobby's father was kind and sweet and supportive, but Bobby barely paid him any attention. He was always more obsessed with getting his mother's approval, which was given very, very sparingly. Garosa Blunt believed that even children needed to prove their worth.
Gravosa? Dude, even her name.
And at a fairly young age, Bobby quickly got down to trying to prove his own. At age 12, he saw a video of a stuntman showing how stunt people take car hits in movies. Bobby watched it over and over and said, "Hey, I could do that." He got the youngest member of his mom's crew, Gib, to drive his car at Bobby slowly in an abandoned parking lot a bunch of times so he could practice getting hit by it. Gib thought it was too dangerous, but Blunt was convincing, and Gib always liked helping Bobby out. After a few days of practice,
As long as you take it nice and slow, you'll probably not be killed.
Bobby started going to a narrow back alley street near his home where the speed limit was technically 20 miles per hour, but people often exceeded that by a fair amount. Bobby would then wait for a car going faster than it should, toss his ball out in front of it, then leap out and get hit by the car. The first few times he did it, he then said he was going to tell the Protection Bureau on the person for speeding. He even once told a man who'd hit him that his dad was a pro boxer and he'd come beat the man up. But regardless of what he said, his intent was the same: to extort money out of the person in exchange for keeping quiet. Bobby got a fair amount of cash out of the first few times he did this, and even more bruises and cuts. He brought this money to his mother. Now, you'd hope even a hardened criminal would show concern for her son's well-being after getting hit by multiple cars.
And yet...
But if you expected that, then you don't know Garosa Blunt. She instead said, "If you're gonna get hit by cars, you should at least get a lot more out of it than a few $100. The next time Bobby went out, he waited for a particularly expensive-looking car. The same routine then went down, but instead of extorting money, Bobby was just distracting the driver, who came out to check on him. Gib then ran over, got in the car, and drove away with it. They planned to bring it to Bobby's mom together, but first decided to take it back to Gib's dad's garage and tune it up a bit, and get rid of the dent Bobby's body had put in the hood. Gibb was an aspiring mechanic who regularly used the money he earned as a part of Garrosa's crew to buy parts for old cars and bikes and soup them up. He even tried making some of his own original inventions with the aid of his gift of electrokinesis. Like 22.2% of people in the world, Gibb had developed natural superhuman abilities. He could conduct green electricity from his fingers, which he'd use on occasion to try charging up machines he was working on.
That's actually kind of
That day in his garage was also the first time Bobby got a taste for invention as well. After that day, he'd get Gibb to teach him everything he knew. Then Bobby would go on to learn far more on his own. But first, they took the fixed-up stolen car to Bobby's mother. This time, she seemed genuinely impressed, and even gave Bobby an aggressive kiss on the head, saying, "That's my boy." That unusual show of affection was a high Bobby would subconsciously be chasing for the rest of his life, and not only from his mother. Bobby and Gibb tried expanding their carjacking scheme, with Gibb even trying to get in on taking the hits. Unfortunately, well, he wasn't nearly as good at it. Skip the gory details, and soon enough, Gibb had a mechanical augment arm where his own right arm had once been. He'd only been able to afford a cheap basic augment, but Bobby took it upon himself to use Gibb's new arm as a testing ground for his budding technological prowess. He ended up making a way to build a concealed pistol inside Gibb's new forearm. The firearm unfolded into pieces that looked like normal functional pieces of an augment, but when Gibb tapped his fingers in a very specific sequence, an unlock would be triggered, the firearm would form together, and he could shoot it like any other pistol.
Now that's clever.
Completing that weapon, then showing it to Garrosa Blunt was the second time Bobby felt that high of her affection. She thought the device was brilliant, and even started seeking out criminals to join her crew who had augments or missing limbs, so that Bobby could rig them up with disguised weapons. Bobby carried on like this through his teenage years and into his young adult life, getting more and more ingrained in his mother's world and constantly seeking new ways to get her affection. He often sought this through new inventions he'd work on with Gibb.
I like the code he has, so that's
and sometimes they'd result in praise, but other times they still weren't good enough for Garrosa to care. Every time she disapproved, though, that just made Bobby more desperate to make something better. Well, he could have been getting joy and satisfaction out of the incredible things he was inventing. He only felt they had worth when his mother said so. Sadly, during this time, Bobby also went on a few robberies and jobs with his mother, and saw her, as well as her allies, killing security guards and even innocent bystanders without giving it much thought. He'd even been with her when she punished those who leaked information on their group to the Protection Bureau or to other gangs. Even if it had happened accidentally, Garrosa Blunt always made a point to show that she was not a merciful woman. It scared Bobby at first, but eventually just became a common sight, enough so that one day he'd start killing himself. He felt a foul churning in his gut after the first time he did it, but only until his mother gave him a kiss on the cheek and said, "That's my boy." You see, there were genuinely good things Bobby was doing in this time. The skills he was honing as an inventor were miraculous, and collaborating with Gibb did make him genuinely happy. But the praise he got from his mother was so much more directly linked to the bad things he'd do with the good that was in him. So, even after his mother was unceremoniously killed in a shootout on a job gone bad, Bobby kept seeking that high of her affection from other sources, doing those same bad things. He and Gibb got out of town after Garrosa's death and moved to Sweden, intending to only stay for a few months, renting out a basement under a garage, like Blunt's mom had always worked out of in Boston. His caring cousin Bella had come to visit him there once early on, hoping he'd take his mother's passing as a sign to start down a more honest path.
Time to start anew.
Bobby got along with Bella. He called her naive and took no heed in her advice. "This is just who we are, Bella. You can try to get out of the game, but I'm gonna play the cards I've been dealt better than anyone else, while Gibb picks everybody's pockets." Bella would return home, but Bobby and Gibb's stay in Sweden would end up much longer than expected. They learned of a startup company in Stockholm called Mechanine Augmentations that was trying to make the next generation of augment limbs, ones that could give even a normal human powers that rivaled someone born with abilities. It had been a
Oh, that is
concept
kind of
many in the
cool.
world had claimed would eventually be tackled by someone, but no person or company had come through. The world's most popular sport, the Global Vigilance League, currently could only pull its fighters from those with superhuman abilities. But if someone could grant non-powered people powers, they'd likely become the wealthiest
Hmm.
person or company on the planet. Currently, the only
And I'm guessing that started his his hunt to being, well, that. A person that can create the augmented limbs of superpowers.
way a non-powered person could gain abilities was by bonding with a unique breed of creature on the island country of Unitalia, called a Biunite. Biunites had
Hey!
supernatural
Cool.
abilities and could physically merge with their bonded partner to grant them those same abilities temporarily. But currently, it was believed by most that the only way to safely make one of these bonds was by using an expensive device called a bond band, produced by the Averitt Corporation. Most people could not afford one of these. This was another reason power from augments was such an appealing notion. Bobby looked into the woman running the startup, Seekter Godava, and found that she was already loaded from a previous business that she'd sold for a hefty sum. He
Oh.
said they should show her some of the best augments they'd adapted to see if she'd buy any of them. Gib thought it couldn't hurt, so they cleaned up Gib's arm, which now had multiple weapon attachments, totally undetectable unless you knew what you were looking for, and brought them to Seekter. She did show a slight degree of intrigue in them, but said they were the wrong kind of upgrades. She wanted to
Damn.
give people genuine superhuman abilities, not just hidden weapons. After that meeting, Gib
It's like, straight up owls, not guns. That's what I'm doing.
thought it was no big deal, that they'd tried and failed and could move on. But Bobby had instantly become obsessed. He needed to make something good enough to impress Seekter. If the only thing that would impress her was an augment that could give someone abilities as good as the ones some people were born with, then why not make an augment that could give someone those exact kinds of abilities? Bobby started researching the genetic and cellular differences between powered and non-powered people. Through that, he came
Alright.
across some interesting stories about corpses of some superpowered people being labeled as dangerous biological weapons because their enhanced cells could be triggered into activating their abilities up to 3 weeks after they had died. Bobby
Damn.
then speculated that those cells could be
That's
harvested and
kind of cool.
repurposed to grant those same powers as the deceased person to someone through an augment. Gib thought it was a big shot in the dark, but was always willing to help Bobby, so they went and robbed the grave of a recently deceased person with cryokinesis. Bobby took
Ice
samples of
manipulation.
blood, tissue, bone marrow, skin, and more types of cells. Through much trial and error, with this body and more to come, Bobby learned that he needed to use different combinations of cells from powered people to reactivate the deceased's abilities.
Ah,
But
that's a
he
good plus
could
step.
do it. Plus, more importantly, Blunt could condense this combination of cells into a fuel rod. With some help from Gib, they were then able to make an augment that, once Gib attached it, he could use any of the fuel rods they'd made and give him the same abilities as the person they'd harvested the cells from. Their
Okay.
successful trial came 10 months after they'd first met Seekter. But luckily for them, she was getting desperate, as none of her own team's work was getting them anywhere, and she was burning through even her vast resources quickly. They made another meeting with her, showed her what they'd created,
check it
and she
out.
was
Boom.
astounded. She praised Bobby and Gib for their work and asked how much they wanted to come on and work for her as her lead engineers. She swore
Take the
that
job.
once they started selling these, they could all become obscenely wealthy. Bobby was elated hearing her praises, but Gib kept him on track and told the woman they couldn't tell her anything about how they'd made this, or about their own careers, until she signed a non-disclosure agreement, swearing her to secrecy. This seemed
Yeah,
like a
that makes-
reasonable enough
that's
request, so
fair.
she did as asked, but afterwards started seeing how sketchy her new associates were. They mentioned their criminal pasts in America, leaving out some of the gorier details, but claimed they were on a new path.
So, hold on. So, this spot in his arm over here, that must be like one of the fuel rods you're talking about then.
They then told her how they'd made the fuel rods,
It's
and
right
that immediately prompted her to say that she couldn't work with them. Bobby, however, was a fairly convincing guy, and told her that she just had to get fuel this way for a short while, and once the company was big enough, they could start getting people with powers to sign up like organ donors, to donate their cells for fuel rods after their death, and the whole thing could become much more above board. Seekter could see a
That
future where that was
does
possible.
make
Many
sense.
people with powers would likely be more than happy to leave their bodies as resources to help those born without, and those who'd lost limbs. If it were earlier in her venture, she likely would have refused, but she needed a win, she knew her intentions were good, so she agreed to the process.
I
For
accept.
now. Both Bobby and Gibb came on as high-paid contracted workers, under the table. They'd acquire the bodies, do the harvesting of cells, and provide them to Mechanine. They'd also sold the blueprints for the augmentations that the fuel rods worked with to the company, even letting Seekter claim that they'd been created by her own in-house inventors. Unfortunately,
That's
as
some good
Seekter
cash.
proudly and eagerly announced her company's prototype to the world, showing off Bobby's invention, her praise towards him soon started to slip. Bobby and Gibb were having a hard time finding easily accessible bodies to harvest cells from, and she started getting frustrated with them for not having more fuel for the first launch of products. The pre-orders had sold out in minutes, and they didn't even have as many viable products as they'd claimed because, well, the arms and legs were built and ready, there were not enough fuel rods for them all. On top...
Do you know how hard it is to find recently dead heroes with still active powers? Like, come on, damn it. It's not like there's just a whole grave pile somewhere. Hurry up and bury that. I told you, we need to hide those hero bodies before anyone else finds them.
Top of that, fuel rods only last
Biohazards.
between 1 to 3 months once activated on a limb, so they'd need far more for the people buying to refuel. The augments did work on a basic level without the fuel rods, but without those rods they couldn't grant the person any superhuman abilities. That was when Bobby decided to try something new, harvesting from a living person. Some of the most
And here we
high-potency
go.
cells to harvest had proven to be those in the tissue of the heart, as well as the skull's bone marrow and the brain. Bobby created a needle-like device that was meant to be able to numb a person, stick into their head, and extract cells from their skull, brain, and blood all in one puncture, but take a small enough amount to do no harm. Bobby then asked Gibb to help him find a superpowered homeless person to test it out on, but Gibb thought that was a bit too cruel even for them. The homeless had hard enough lives without being kidnapped and used as lab rats.
Yeah,
Bobby was aggressively insistent,
Like the
though,
movie.
and soon, just to dissuade him from using one of them, Gibb offered to be the test subject himself. Bobby should have known better than to test something
And thus giving his arm the green lightning we see it as now.
so experimental on one of his few real friends, or on any living person for that matter, but even still, he replied, "Hey, bud, if you're willing, let's get drillin'." He activated the device
Damn
on
it,
Gibb's head and
Hans.
stuck it into him. Gibb started hyperventilating as soon as the needle went in. He said it didn't hurt that the numbing had worked, but that he felt an overwhelming sense of fear and panic. Even though he couldn't physically feel much, it was like his mind and body knew something was horribly wrong. He started shaking,
Something isn't
and
right.
Bobby tried to hold him still. The process took 5 minutes of Gibb on the brink of collapse the entire time. But when it was done and the needle was out, it was quickly revealed that it had worked, though it had only
Success.
gotten enough for about a 1/12 of a fuel rod. In
Shit.
his desperation to show a new success to Seekter, Bobby talked Gibb into going another few rounds. Gibb didn't want to. It freaked him out in a way he still didn't even really understand, but as always, he did want to help Bobby out. He agreed to go
Oh, no,
through the
Gibb.
next 11 rounds over the course of 2 days to make a full fuel rod from his green lightning powers, but Bobby talked him into doing it all in 1 day.
Oh, crap.
Though they didn't end up getting to the 12th round. On the 10th round, Gibb did actually collapse just before the process was done. Bobby waited until the needle retracted itself, then tried to playfully smack his friend awake. But Gibb didn't wake up.
Nope.
Bobby was horrified.
He's dead,
He had
isn't
just
he?
killed his closest friend.
Yep, damn
This
it.
was
called
one
it.
of those
Shit.
awful moments in life that slaps you in the face and tries to force you to see who you are and where you've taken yourself. Some will take it as a sign that they are on the wrong path. But others, like Bobby, will simply take the hit as proof of how cruel life is and continue on down into the darkness. Bobby then harvested as
Oh,
much as he
no,
could
Bobby.
from Gibb's body, but kept those fuel rods for himself to not arouse suspicion when he told Seekter that Gibb had decided to back out of their work and go home to America. Without Gibb to dissuade him from doing so, Bobby then started doing as he'd first planned for harvesting from the living.
Oh,
He
great.
went and kidnapped homeless people with abilities to use his device on. Seekter
Damn,
learned
Bobby.
what Bobby was doing, but tried to pretend she didn't know. She'd come so far and swore to herself whatever Blunt was doing, it was all for the greater good, that she was giving to the world more than Blunt was taking. Eventually, a few of her biggest investors found out what was happening, and most of them claimed they were going to keep their mouths shut and just press on. One, however, said he was compelled to go to the authorities about Blunt and what the company was doing, unless his investment was returned tenfold as a fee for his silence.
Tenfold?
This was mentioned to
Jeez.
Bobby, and, well, he showed Seekter and the other investors what Garosa Blunt had taught Bobby to do to snitches. After that, Blunt made more harvesting devices and hired other criminals to do the work for him so he could keep his hands cleaner at a distance. During this time, Blunt even decided that he wanted one of these augments for himself. He likely could have made one to go over his arm, or leg, or head, but he'd always liked the idea of having a completely concealed weapon as part of his body, like Gibb had had for so many years. And so, as we must do so many times in his story, skipping the gory details, Bobby removed one of his arms and replaced it with an augment.
Seemingly
His own
right
unique one was better than those he'd sold to Mechanine, as his could hold up to 3 fuel rods and activate 3 different abilities at once. He also made it small enough that he could conceal it under a rubbery, skin-like sleeve that made it look as though he still had his normal arm, though it didn't quite feel like flesh, so he often avoided shaking hands with people. Mechanine grew and grew and was right on the brink of people with their devices being accepted into the Global Vigilance League, which would have guaranteed the company get launched into fame and success beyond Seekter's wildest dreams. Unfortunately, Blunt's hired goons were sloppier than Blunt himself. Other members of Seekter's staff learned what was happening, where the fuel rods were coming from, and then it just took one whistleblower for the whole house of cards to come tumbling down. Nobody ratted on Bobby out of fear of what he'd do to them. Bobby himself repeated an old pattern, leaving the country and subconsciously looking for a new figure to gain approval from through his inventions and work. He moved to the island country of Unitalia, mainly to get some more sun in its warm climate, but this would coincidentally lead him to his next employment offer. Blunt was tracked down by a man named Choyo McCade. He worked for the Averitt Corporation, and with their connections and vast resources, he'd actually been able to learn just who Bobby was and what he'd done for Mechanine. Instead of finding Blunt to threaten him or blackmail him, though, Mr. McCade came with an employment offer. He wanted Blunt to develop for them a version of his augments that was fueled not by human cells, but by Bionite cells. Mr. McCade proposed that if
those Bionite cells are probably a lot more powerful as well.
Bobby could harvest the cells of superpowered humans, he could likely also harvest cells from the superpowered creatures of Unitalia. Mr. McCade said Blunt's work would be kept under wraps, and he'd be paid handsomely for his research, under the table. McCade said that, if this worked, they'd find a humane way, or at least acceptable enough to the general population, to harvest Bionite cells later on. But, in the meantime, Blunt was told to use whatever means or force necessary, so long as he never revealed to anyone who he was working for, as they'd deny any connection to him.
And now we reach the part of the story that leads to his left arm.
Blunt was intrigued by the challenge and thought McCade's proposal made sense, so he used the power of his own augment to capture and restrain a Bionite, and used his harvesting device on it, unfortunately proving that it was possible. In fact, Bionites could survive far more rounds with the harvesting tool than humans had proven able to. Not only that, but by studying the Bionites he captured, he found that their unique biology, having the ability to warp and transform to merge with a human, could be utilized in far more interesting ways than had been possible with human harvested cells. The device he started developing was far beyond that of anything he'd made before. Even he didn't fully understand what he was doing or how it was possible, but by fusing Bionite cells into the metal of a custom augment, the creation could transform almost like the metal was melting and move over different parts of a person's body. Similar to
Now
how
he
a
is pulling the
Bionite can
venom.
be replacing and enhancing a person's arm one minute, then their leg the next. He showed the prototype of this to Mr. McCade and a few higher-ups at Averitt who were in the know, and they were absolutely floored. Their pupils may as well have transformed into dollar signs. They all rushed to make ads and PR pushes to shift public perception on augmentation users, which had been so damaged after the Mechanine Augment court trials, and planned to launch these devices, codenamed Biomechs, in a few years, swearing it would be even bigger and more profitable than their
Biomechs.
Bond bands. Blunt would have liked the project to be rushed out faster, but Averitt wanted to wait, to make sure the reveal was far enough from the Mechanine debacle as necessary to ensure the biggest launch possible. In that time, Bobby harvested more Bionites, made more prototypes, and eventually got a bit bored. He started going out, getting in trouble, and drawing too much attention to himself concerning the higher-ups at Averitt. To try and keep him busy, Mr. McCade offered Bobby some other work that utilized his lack of morals to the corporation's advantage. About a year before they planned to announce Biomechs to the world, some kids in Unitalia started making a big scene in the middle school and high school Unitalia Vigilants tournaments that was bad for Averitt's business. These kids were bonding with Bionites without Bond bands, and proving to be incredibly effective fighters, beyond that of people who used the bands.
Oh, wait, that's good.
Averitt had spent tens of millions of dollars on marketing, propaganda, and buying off news sources to push the idea that Bond bands were the only safe way to make bonds with Bionites, despite the natives of Unitalia having done without them for millennia. If the general population began to realize that Bond bands were unnecessary, then Averitt's profits on one of their most successful products would plummet.
So
They needed Blunt to get, or create, proof that these kids bonding naturally were putting themselves and others in danger. It was a task beneath his skill set for invention, but still desperate for approval, and feeling a bit bored, Bobby agreed. Unfortunately, some of these clever kids would get the better of Blunt and out him as a criminal with a now illegal Mechanine Augment arm to the authorities. A hunt was started for him, and Blunt was nearly captured by a very determined Protection Bureau officer named Trayton Fuego. The officer had found and invaded the garage basement Bobby was working out of, and got some evidence of what Bobby was doing in Unitalia, nearly revealing Averitt's affiliation with him. Mr. McCade chewed out Bobby for this and told him, "You are not needed here anymore, Blunt. We'll wire you your percentage every month for the Biomech profits, but besides that, go hide somewhere. Keep out of trouble and shut up. We don't need you to give the Protection Bureau any more evidence leading them to us." Unfortunately, having his new source of approval so furious at him just made Blunt all the more furious himself at the kids who'd outed his actions to the authorities. He was even more desperate now to get the evidence Averitt had wanted, that natural Bionite bonds were dangerous. He kept spying on these kids from a great distance, and learned that one of them, Camille Hadsia, was going to make her Vigilance debut at an event called the Unitalia Vigilance Exhibition Tournament. Upon further investigation, he found that even more of the kids he'd been made to spy on were attending as well. It was a new event, but astoundingly, it had been announced that some of the biggest names in the global vigilance scene were going to be in attendance, even the current global champion, Freya Sparks. On top of all of that, one of the two tournament organizers was the sister of that pesky officer, Trayton Fuego. If Blunt could make naturally bonded Bionites turn on their partners there, it would be news seen around the world and humiliate Fuego's family as an extra bit of added revenge. So Blunt got to work making preparations to hurt whoever he had to get the approval he was so desperate for. Approval he could find in so many better ways, but never decided to make the needed change to find them. So let Bobby's story be a lesson, because
Now I'm actually really curious. What would happen if Bobby Blunt actually did end up teaming up with Benny Sharp?
all this time, Bella Blunt has been off living a quiet but very happy and fulfilling life. Despite having a similar grim start to her tale, she forced herself off the dark path early on, and Bobby just descended farther and farther along it.
He just kept
Perhaps in another life, given another chance in similar circumstances, he could have seen the light and made a change. When presented with better people, he could choose to surround himself with their kind and find approval from both within and by doing good with his gifts. But if that was what Bobby had done, then his story would not be called The Tragedy of Bobby Blunt.
Bum, bum, bum. This was actually really good, and I like it. Alright.
I was very hesitant to tell a story this grim in Vigilance because this series is meant to be fun, uplifting, inspiring stories that help give people lessons on how to live better, more fulfilling lives and be happier and their more authentic selves. But I did think it was kind of an interesting change of pace to have a grim villain story worked in here. So I apologize for a bit of a downer episode in a series that's supposed to be uplifting, but I hope you all enjoyed it. And the next one is going to be very uplifting because it will be Freya Sparks Part 3. And if you want to see what may or may not be a much more upbeat reincarnation of Bobby Blunt, you can check out some of Benny Sharp's episodes in Multiverse Tales.
Yep,
but I love you all, I hope you all enjoyed this, and you can check out the next Popcross Studios video on Friday. Goodbye.
Alright everyone, that's going to be the end of today's video, and I hope you all enjoyed this. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Link to the original will be in the description below, and I'll see all of y'all next time when we flick it back on. Till then, this is Fox, signing out. Peace.